Howdy doodles, I'm Presby Kennedy, and these are posts taken from the subreddit r/DMacademy, where I try to answer some questions struggling dungeon masters have about Dungeons & Dragons. So sit back, relax, and let's learn some stuff. The advice we have today in our first section is making bad insight rolls consequential. Our second section, improvising sessions, and our third and final session, giving advice to a new dungeon master. All right, the first piece of advice we have today is how do I make bad insight rolls more consequential? When a player rolls an insight check and does very poorly, it seems like it would make sense to me that their character becomes convinced that about an incorrect assumption regarding the person and situation. However, if a player rolls a 4, they're not going to believe any information I give them. Is there a way to hide from the player how well they actually did on the roll without taking away the advantage of being able to be confident in the information they get if they rolled really well? I picked this advice because it's a common problem most parties face. If a player has reason to believe an NPC is lying and they roll a check and see they failed, they instantly mistrust what the DM is about to say to them. Rolling dice and making checks is one of the really fun parts of D&D, and one of my philosophies as a dungeon master is to try my best to make as few rolls for the players as possible. An easy answer to this question, you could secretly make insight rolls for the players and tell them what they learned from the check without sharing the rolled result. But if you wanted to answer this question while keeping my earlier philosophy in mind, I have a piece of advice. The best way to tackle this is understanding insight checks better. Page 178 of the Player's Handbook describes insight as your wisdom insight check decides whether you can determine the true intentions of a creature, such as when searching out a lie or predicting someone's next move. Doing so involves gleaming clues from body language, speech habits, and changes in mannerisms. Insight is used for a confirmation of suspicions and to determine if your assumptions have weight. If a player fails an insight check to determine if a character is lying, that doesn't mean they believe the lying character, that just means the player can't confirm their suspicions. I like to ask players to be very specific when they ask to make an insight check, and I often ask questions like, could you clarify? What are you trying to determine? Or, what specific part of her statement are you insight checking? What are you trying to learn? Let's say a player simply states, I want to know if they're lying. If you have properly set up the parameters of the check, if they roll a 4 and you respond with, you can't tell if they're lying, the player is still able to ambiguously act on their suspicions. The player can't tell if their suspicions are correct or incorrect and proceeds forward on assumptions. If they roll an 18 and pass the check, you can respond with, you know they're lying by a tell on their face, and the player can proceed forward with confidence. Our next piece of advice is about improvising sessions. I like improvising sessions. I do like having an overall plan for stuff the party can do, and when story stuff happens, it's roughly planned out and stuff, but for normal sessions where we aren't trekking through the courtyard to the evil wizard's castle, I just improv. For instance, last session I was down a player, which is fine, in universe, their character was actually in another city for specific reasons, and they didn't need to join the party again instantly. So the 4 remaining players did some RP and then went to my Adventurers Guild. They discovered that the job board was empty and the lady who managed it had been kidnapped by bandits. Some world travel later and the party finds some lizardmen mercenaries they had showed mercy to a few sessions ago. They had been recruited into the bandit tribes and had kidnapped the Adventurers Guild clerk. This was all improvised on the spot based on what they had done and where they went. That's my favorite way to DM. What's your proudest improv moment or session? This is great, and I wanted to share it because a lot of people who want to get into dungeon mastering just stop and think like, oh, I have to have this great plan for everything in every session. I need to have these stats rolled up and these creatures and these encounters, and I need to da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And it's just so easy to get bogged down with prepping that you never take time to enjoy and play. Improvising sessions for me as a dungeon master is really, really fun. And if anybody watches the ongoing series that I run, the Ilderon Tales, I improv a lot of the elements of that session, and I think it's the most fun part about D&D is being able to tell a living story and not wholly know where the story is going to land and where it's going to end up. So the thing we can all take away from this is I like how the Dungeon Master took elements and places that they had traveled and people, or places they had traveled to and people that they had met and helped out, and brought them back into the world so that it felt like the party's choices in the past were meaningful to the content they were engaging in now. And that's a really, really great element for improv, is when you're looking for story threads and things to do, look on the past interactions of the party and the things that the party has done, so that as the content weaves and creates itself into the future, you're already working and building off of a story that's organically grown from your players' decisions and the things that you've done and made. What is my proudest improv moment or session? I took some time to think about this question, and I thought about one of my favorite moments of improv and what made it successful. So there was a group of NPCs that I introduced just to die, and the sole reason was to show how strong another group of characters were. And these NPCs were pretty powerful themselves. But through the actions of the players, they ended up saving these NPCs several times over. And so I had this extra group of NPCs that I didn't really need or want in my story. So every time something really, really ridiculously dangerous came up, I always volunteered those NPCs and put them at the forefront of the action, just so that I could eventually move them out of the way of the story. And these NPCs got a reputation among my players as being these almost expendable action star heroes of charging into these perilous situations, and just somehow through the actions of the players and, the rolls of the dice that night and the situations that arrive, these NPCs would survive. And it just led to really, really, really fun moments. And one of the characters in my campaign actually created a new character 16 years later in the same set of campaigns that is the daughter of one of these NPCs who just absolutely refused to die. I think what made this very successful is that I clearly did have plans for the NPCs. The players had a different idea, and due to the characters' actions, these NPCs ended up living. And so when they revisit the players and they keep showing up and helping out in these big moments, where I, as the Dungeon Master, are trying to kill them and they survive and stay alive, it feels that much more thrilling and fulfilling for all of the characters that they continue to, or for all the players that they continue to live and their decisions have an ongoing impact in the world. So I think if we could take away anything from this question, it would be let your players' decisions guide you moving forward, and let your players' decisions be meaningful, and don't get too bogged down in plans. All right, let's move on to the next piece of advice. Our final piece of advice is to a new Dungeon Master. New blood here. I started playing D&D late last year and was instantly hooked. I had never had an opportunity to play before then, and I'm currently playing in 2 different campaigns. After some encouragement from my fiancé, I began writing my first ever campaign. I've been working on the world for about 2 weeks and have found myself working on building cities and lore anytime I get the chance. Any tips for a rookie Dungeon Master? I included this post because a lot of Dungeon Masters have already chimed into this discussion and gave some really great resources and advice for new Dungeon Masters. There are lots of people like Matt Colville, XP to level 3, or Runesmith who take time to create really great D&D videos on YouTube that you can watch and learn a lot of awesome dungeon mastering tips. There's great tools for being a dungeon master and organizing your information, such as the fandom wikis or World Anvil. There are great map making tools such as Asgar's Fantasy Map Generator or Incarnate. While people have already answered this question really well, one issue that I saw in a lot of the replies is when people give out dungeon mastering advice, they forget one of the most important elements that is a part of D&D, and that is advice about the players and your role as a dungeon master interacting with the players. So I wanted to take a quick second to talk on that subject. So while there are lots of great things you can do as a dungeon master, at the end of the day, D&D is a collaborative role-playing game. As the dungeon master, you are the lens through which everybody plays this game, and you should be mindful of the other players around the story. When it comes to writing and creating a campaign, it's easy to think that you want to create the biggest, coolest world, and you want to write like this really awesome campaign and story to tell your players, but you shouldn't be telling your players anything. You should be creating with your players and allowing a story to evolve in collaboration. It is a collaborative role-playing game. So what I mean by that is, while it is great to have a campaign, you really need to have a group of players first and understand what the players want, what they want to pursue, what you're able to provide them with, and then from the characters they decide to bring and build, work with them in involving them in the world that you have created, and then find a really cool point in your world to tell a story around the characters that you have. Communication is very important for this game, and communicating with your players is going to yield you a lot of positive results rather than doing things in a vacuum. Don't be afraid to screen players out for things that you think are important to D&D that might not be important to them. There's a lot of people who want to play this game, and you can find people who have very similar ideas to you. So if you really, really like role-playing and you don't really care about combat too much, or combat makes you uncomfortable, find a group of players who really want to be in a role-play heavy session. If you don't feel too comfortable with role-play and you want to do more combat, find a group of players that feel more comfortable with that. Don't be afraid to discuss your expectations as a dungeon master of what you expect out of the players who will be in your game, and also ask your players what their expectations are of you as a dungeon master. You would be surprised how many new dungeon masters are really terrified to just talk to their players and ask them what they want. I will give this final piece of advice, and this might be revealing a secret in my playbook. A lot of players that I end up dungeon mastering have a really, 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 really great time in my sessions and express how much they enjoy playing in my sessions. But the process upon which that I screen and interview and talk to my players is very intense, to the point where I learn all the aspects of what they enjoy about role-playing and what they enjoy about D&D. And then once they tell me the things that they enjoy, I am able to deliver the things that they enjoy to them. And then they end up enjoying themselves, and they're surprised of just like, wow, you're such a good dungeon master. And just like, well, no, we just communicated and we talked well and we understood like what each other wanted out of this game. And then we, gave each other what we wanted, and we had fun doing it. So communication is going to be really, really like the biggest skill you can develop as a dungeon master starting out playing D&D, and will land you with a group that really enjoys being around you and that you enjoy playing with. So don't be afraid to communicate more with your group. In summary, what we have learned today: 4 insight rules. Take an opportunity to refresh yourself on insight rules and insight checks, and let your players know what the meaning and purpose of an insight check is. When your players ask to make insight check, remove the ambiguity around the roll and ask them to be very specific about the knowledge that they're trying to. For improvising sessions, be very fluid and let your players' meaningful decisions come back to guide some of your decisions moving forward into the rest of the campaigns and sessions that you run. For new dungeon masters, there's a lot of really great advice out there on YouTube. You can look it up, but your number one skill that I think is going to benefit you most in the long run is becoming a better communicator and communicating with your party. Links to all the posts discussed here are in the description of the video. Let me know in the comment section what you think of my solutions or if you would do anything differently. Please subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this, and give this video a like. It really helps me beat one of the hardest bosses I'm stuck on, YouTube's algorithm. I mean, honestly, if any of you guys have found out how to get past this level, let me know. Have a great day, and bye!